So to explain warding, we first have to go back to preschool where we were playing with blocks and eating sand, and ask the most basic questions of why, when, where, and how. So the most obvious reason to ward is so you don't get put in an eternal grey screen by everyone's favourite neighbourhood kitty cat.
No! God, please, no! No!
Another good reason to ward is to ward lane bushes so you can get lane control, so your opponent can't hide in the bush or use the bush to drop minion aggro. This is most commonly done in bot lane because using a ward top lane or mid lane, for example, leaves you vulnerable to jungle ganks, whereas in bot lane you have twice as many wards to work with. And lastly, vision control. This basically refers to when you clear enemy vision, make sure you're not sitting on wards, and also take control of an area in terms of vision. This is done throughout all stages of the game, but it's most noticeable during dragon fights. Taking control of vision in this fashion means you're at an advantage over their opponent, since they can't see how many members you have in this fight, your members' positionings, or even spells they happen to use, as well as other factors like how low their dragon is, whether your team has actually started killing the dragon, etc. Having good warding around the dragon fight can often be the difference between winning or losing the fight, especially when you have members using teleport to join the fight, so they'll need a nicely placed ward so they can teleport into a strong position. Often fights like these you'll be solely relying on wards to tell you information about where the enemy is so you can win this fight. You can see how important vision is here, when the enemy support is popping scanner and actively clearing vision in the middle of a fight. This results in the blue side being in complete darkness about the whereabouts of the enemy team. This results in our team being susceptible to getting engaged on from Fog of War. You can see here, even with a dragon fight going on, vision is still being placed continually and cleared by both teams, and each team works to defend their vision. Vision is the most important piece of the puzzle to win the fight. You can't fight your enemy if you can't see them. And ultimately, no vision means you need to face check, which means using your character to get vision itself, which often puts you in a bad situation, where fighting is mandatory and you don't really have an option to back out, since you're already so close to the enemy. When face checking is done, however, you often want it done by your tanky teammates. This is because it puts them on the front line where they usually want to be, and minimizes the risk of a squishy carry getting instant killed. When to ward is fairly simple. You want to get wards down before something happens, before the jungler ganks you, before the dragon fight happens. Having a ward after the fact is really doing nothing for you. One of the most important times to put a ward you need to be aware of comes into play when the jungler finishes his first clear. Usually, junglers doing a full clear from top to bot or bot to top will finish their clear at around 3 minutes. This does vary very heavily depending on champ, some finishing their clear at 2 minutes 50 while others finishing a bit later. But in general, the scuttle spawns at 3 minutes. This means most junglers are going to be taking this scuttle and then looking to recall or potentially gank. This means if you ward at around the 3 minute mark, you risk putting yourself in danger of the enemy jungle jumping you in the pixel bush, which a lot of the time in lower elos is where top laners and bot laners die. Not getting a ward down at this timing means you have no idea where the jungler currently is, and whether they're lane ganking you or just walking up for a regular gank. In this situation, as an example, I noticed that Olaf never went into the river to place a ward, so I knew I could freely walk into top lane and prepare lane gank. While this looks silly, technically I'm losing absolutely nothing since I have no camps on the map, and only just now are they starting to respawn. So junglers have a fair bit of time that they can kill just waiting in lane for something to happen or waiting to gank you. This is why knowing the whereabouts of a jungle is extremely crucial to avoiding getting ganked. The start of the jungle tracking process begins much earlier, however. In fact, often before the jungle camps even start to spawn. Finding out where the jungle started is really important. This means placing a ward on one of their first camps, oftentimes a buff or raptors. Knowing where the jungle started is very important for knowing where they're likely to be. When junglers clear their camps, they typically start from one side of the jungle and work their way towards the other side. This is the most efficient way for them to clear their camps, and thus the most commonly used method. Thus, knowing where the jungler started means you know where they're most likely going to appear, whether it be topside river or botside river at the 3 minute mark. Which by extension means you know which lanes are in most danger of getting early ganked, and which lanes can play more aggressive without the threat of jungle pressure. As I touched on earlier, this is often done with a level 1 ward before jungle camps even spawn. This is most commonly done by a jungler or the mid laner. However, it can be done by pretty much any role. It's important to keep an eye out on whether we see the jungler, like we just did there in this clip. However, dropping a ward is the best way to be sure. As you can see in this clip, we've seen the jungle on her blue buff, and yet she didn't start it. We know this because of the ward. This ward is typically placed on their raptors or their blue buff, however any camp pretty much works fine. Raptors camp being easy to access in particular is a really good place to place a ward. This is because you can tell a lot about the enemy jungle from when they are seen on that ward. If you didn't know, each jungle camp is worth 4 CS, so when you hold tab and see your enemy jungle has 8 CS, you know they've taken 2 jungle camps. If an enemy jungler appears on a ward and they have 8 CS, and they're taking raptors currently, and they have a red buff, you can assume that they have taken red buff, Krugs, and now they're doing their raptors. This is why a ward on raptors is slightly more favorable than a ward on the red buff itself. You can tell exactly which camps have been taken just by counting their CS numbers. And this is not a hard thing to do like people will make out, especially for the early levels. Where to place a ward is the most complex part about warding. One way I like to think about it is to break it up into 3 stages of the game: early game, mid game, and late game. As we've been talking about for most of this video and what people traditionally think of when they think of warding, early game consists of tracking where the enemy jungle is in particular. The way you place wards is going to have to change every single game, depending on what jungle you're versing. You have to take into account how this jungle typically ganks and what gank routes they're going to use, so you know where to put your wards and what will be effective and what will be ineffective. A lot of jungles have specific tools that let them bypass obvious ward spots, like jumping over walls, running down your lane for ganks instead of going through the jungle, etc. This is a big problem in lower elos where they struggle to ward against certain champs like Nocturne or Evelynn, for example, because they use basic wards that might work against other junglers, but are rendered completely ineffective versus these champions that can just bypass it with Nocturne ult or Evelynn just walking straight over them while invisible. While a typical pixel bush ward might work against certain junglers like Warwick or Amumu, when you're versing junglers like Evelynn that have advanced gank tools, you need to plan accordingly. And instead of setting up these bare bones wards around your lane, instead set up wards on their jungle camps so you know when they're in the area and you can back off well in advance. When the mid game starts around 14 minutes or so, when the outer turrets start to go down, tracking important enemy carries like their ADC for example become much more important. You need to do this for multiple reasons: to stay safe from the enemy carries collapsing on you, and also to get picks. Now, when thinking about where you actually want to ward, I want to bring back a clip from the last episode. Imagine a line that cuts the map. You want to stay in line with all your teammates when you're split pushing. If you're way past this line, say this Ahri was pushing up to this tier 2, she's quite vulnerable to being ganked. Now in this clip I was talking about split pushing, but a similar concept applies to warding. Where you want to place your wards is heavily dependent on this line. You want your wards in a line like this so that the enemy can't sneak past them, essentially creating a wall where if the enemy wants to cross this line, you'll be aware of it. As your line of pressure expands, you ideally want to move these wards up, so that way you're always aware of incoming danger. Obviously due to ward cooldowns you can't always do this, but the general concept remains. Wards follow your map pressure, so you want to be using more defensive wards when you're behind, and using more aggressive wards when you're ahead. You can think of this like a tug of war. You don't want to give your enemy space when you're ahead, but when you're behind you don't really have a choice. They're taking space from you. And if you ever want to take it back, you need to take your space back first before you can work on taking theirs. Late game warding consists of all the elements of mid game warding. The main difference here, however, is after you get to 25-30 minutes into the game, everyone is usually quite a high level, meaning their respawn timers are a lot longer than earlier in the game. This means getting a pick on the enemy players becomes much more effective, and can mean winning the game outright or getting objectives over your opponents. You can think of the line of pressure being your main wards that you place throughout the game. You're always going to need these wards down to make sure you don't get picked or get surprised by an enemy flank. In the late game, you're going to want to go one step further than these wards so you can try and establish picks across the map. In general, you don't want to use blue or control wards to do this, as the enemy is made aware that they're on vision and can potentially take steps to avoid getting killed. Stealth wards are the best option for this. So where should you place these wards? These wards should be placed in areas where they're unlikely to be cleared, as well as areas deep enough in the enemy territory that you can get a grasp of where the champion plans on going to. For example, if you place a ward here on this bush, you can anticipate the person walking over it might be going to clear their red buff, which allows your team to walk into a nearby bush with scanner and set up a trap for them. This is the general idea, and there's not really any hard and fast places where you should always put wards, as even unpopular wards can be really effective if people don't anticipate them being there. So instead of telling you exactly where you should ward, or pretending I know all the best spots, I just want to go over a few things that your ward should do. So to start off with stealth wards, the most important thing is to cover multiple paths with your ward. You use stealth wards instead of other ward types for aggressive warding, and also ensure your vision isn't overlapping or irrelevant. A warding setup like this, for example, covers 2 jungle entrances. These entrances have many different ways that a jungler could path through and still be seen on that ward, meaning this ward is a great value ward, which is likely to see someone during its lifespan. If we instead place our second ward down here, this may look like a safe bot lane where you're well defended. However, the problem is you're doubling up on ward vision. A jungler walking through this path is already spotted on the first ward, making the second one completely redundant. You don't need to know that he's still there, you already know that he's there in the first place, thanks to your first ward. When placing your wards in general, you want to think about where the enemy is likely to path, and then try to cover as many paths as you can with each individual ward. This means placing wards on the intersecting points or crossroads of these paths. This will lead to more effective ward use as a whole. Just remember to keep your wards relatively in line, so that way the jungler has no way to sneak past them, or at least minimizes the chances of them sneaking past them to the best of your ability. Control wards and farsight wards are used very differently. These wards are usually placed inside bushes because they're both visible. The bush helps to hide the ward unless the enemy champion actually physically checks the bush, meaning they usually get to live quite long, compared to when not placed in a bush. Control wards are used to control enemy vision. These are usually placed in highly contested areas such as the middle of the river, to allow your own jungler to know that there's no ward present and they can look for a gank. Blue wards, on the other hand, have a special effect of having a very high range that they can be placed from. This means they can be placed safely from the river all the way into the enemy's jungle, making them the best ward to use when you suspect the enemy is planning an ambush and you have to move into an area, for example trying to contest Baron. Both these ward types have no lifespan. Control wards must be killed by the enemy and have 4 hit points, whereas Farsight wards only have 1. These wards will last forever. However, Farsight, if the enemy walks close enough, they will die automatically. Both these wards are also visible to the enemy. How to ward is a task that comes with experience. It's very hard to explain how you should go about warding. In support role, for example, you must know that your ADC is safe and isn't at a risk of getting killed when you leave to do your warding. So I just wanted to highlight a few basic things that you should think about. First of all, how tanky are you? Can you afford to walk into a bush that has an assassin in it? Are you going to instantly die if they happen to be in that bush? Secondly is your mobility. If you're playing a champ like Rakan, for example, you might have an easier time placing more aggressive wards because you can always jump over a wall to get out if you happen to get in a spicy situation. However, if you're playing Soraka, you might be left in the dust with no mobility to escape an assassin, for example. So aggressive warding might not be the greatest idea, unless you have your team with you. The next thing to consider is enemy locations. If you know where 4 enemies are and you're just missing the last one, and the last one isn't the biggest threat to you, you're fine to go in and do aggressive warding, or ward where you need to. However, if you don't have the location of 5 enemies, it's a bit risky to go in and ward a bush because they all could be for, sitting in that bush waiting to kill you. The more problems you have in these areas means the more allies you're going to need to help you. If you're playing Soraka with no mobility and no tankiness, and you don't know the location of all 5 enemies, you're going to need your whole team to back you up to go into enemy land and place wards. Whereas if you're playing Alistar and you have the location of 4 enemies, you're pretty safe to go in an aggressive ward all by yourself. Warding in an extremely risky scenario is never a good idea, because the purpose of the ward is to stop you getting killed. And if you're putting yourself in an extremely risky situation where you could potentially die, defeats the purpose of the ward entirely. This is not to say you won't die while trying to place or clear wards. It does happen very often, but you should try to work to minimize this, as you have to remember you being alive is always more important than the ward. The last thing I want to talk about is Faelights. These appear as a little ring of mushrooms inside bushes, and they empower your wards placed in them. They give you an extra added area of vision range temporarily, which does expire and recede over time. Any enemy that sees you place this ward, and also enemies that walk into this vision area using scanner, will be alerted that they are spotted by a Faelight with an icon above their head. These areas are very strong and very impactful places to place a ward. Some of these Faelights spawn at different stages of the game. For example, this one spawns after the second dragon has been killed. Keep this in mind in case different Faelights are ever added or removed from the game. These Faelights are very strong places to place a ward because of the extra vision you get. However, they come with the obvious downside of being a very forecasted spot to place a ward, meaning any competent jungler will avoid the vision range of this Faelight and expect there to be wards in that location. This can allow junglers to bypass your wards more easily as they expect where they're going to be placed. For this reason, Faelights shouldn't be used every single time, as Faelights tend to act more like a crutch for bad warding, rather than very good ward spots. They do tend to be really good positions for control wards and things of that nature, since they can't be hidden anyways. And they definitely do have a time and place to use them. Some Faelights, like this one for example, are especially useful when split pushing, and give you very good knowledge on when someone is actually collapsing on you, allowing you the time you need to get out of the situation. And one last bonus tip, did you know if you left click a ward that you can see the source of the ward? This is useful when a ward is placed over a wall or you don't have vision of who placed it, but want to know who's currently in the area. Anyways, that's all I've got for this episode. If you enjoyed or learned something, I'd appreciate the like and sub, and stay tuned for the next episode, which I'll be covering team fighting. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.
Fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life, I never miss that fact.